Hello Internet, welcome back to the dungeon. My name is Gal, and today in the video I'm going to show you guys how to make this dark creepy crystal. I'm going to talk about how to sculpt the flaming soul fire, the crystal itself, and how to create the lighting and glowing effect that I made for the crystal itself. So if you like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And without too much further ado, let's hop right into it. So the first thing we need to do is to cut out the rough shape of the crystal. To do this, I take a large rectangular piece of XPF foam and I just put it through the hot wire cutter, slicing off the edges, making sure to take off the hard edge of the XPF, leaving all of the facets of the crystal with the same kind of external surface. Now, I wanted to give my crystal a cracked, worn look, and I needed a place for the flame that I wanted the sculpt to burst out of. So I cut in some cracks into the crystal using a sculpting knife. Now the XPF where I live has rather large bubbles, even the blue one. So, to compensate for this, I take some filler that I bought at the hardware store and I simply give the entire crystal a coat of filler. This filler is rather hard and dries really fast, so I work in segments, doing one part of the crystal, then doing the other. Now the layer is supposed to be rather thin, so don't overdo it. Once the filler is dry, I take a nail file and I go over the entire surface of the crystal, sanding it down, getting it really smooth, yet making sure to maintain all of the edges nice and clean. Once the crystal is done, I cut out my base. I'm using green 8mm MDF for this. I simply cut out a square piece of MDF to fit the shape of the platform that I want to make for the crystal. Once the base is cut, I cut out a smaller square piece of XPF foam and I mark with a pencil where I'm going to draw and cut my floor tiles and stone blocks. Now I wanted to give each side of the platform a few steps, so I cut those out at this stage. Simply use a box cutter knife to slice into the platform, and then using my pencil, I redraw the tiles around where I cut the stage. To texture the base, I use the tinfoil ball method, simply rolling a ball of tinfoil over the entire model, making sure not to forget the edges. Once I finish texturing the entire platform surface, I go over the lines that I drew for the stone blocks and floor tiles with an X-Acto knife, creating a 2 to 3mm indent for each line. If you go further than that, you might get lines that are harder to paint, so try to be gentle with the knife. Once all my cuts are done, I take a soft pencil and I go over each line. This not only emphasizes the shape of the floor tiles and stone blocks, it also makes them easier to see for when I paint them. That's why it's important to use a soft point pencil for this, or a pen, so that each line becomes more visible. Now I wanted to give the platform blocks more of an emphasized shape, so I pushed some of them in using dice or the handle of one of my tools. Once I was done texturing and emphasizing the lines, I went back with my pencil and drew some cracks on the floor tiles and the stone blocks on the sides, pushing some of them aside and giving the entire platform a much more worn look. For the last step of aging the platform, I took my X-Acto knife and snapped off some of the stone blocks and tiles. This aged the platform considerably, but created places on the platform that were untextured and where I had little division between stone blocks. So I went back with my pencil and redefined the division between stone blocks where it needed, and took my small texture roller and just reapplied some texture where needed. Of course, making sure to watch Matt Colville as I worked to really push my DMing that much further. Once the platform was all textured up, it was time to mark where I was going to put my crystal down. I did this using a pen, and I cut out a small divot into the platform using my knife. As I was going to need a steel wire armature for the flames that I was going to sculpt in the future, I decided that I would connect the crystal to the base using the same armature. To do this, I first twisted a few steel wires together to create the armature. Then, using a skewer, I made a hole through the bottom crack in the crystal, pushing it through the crystal and into the platform. Then, I took my twisted steel wire and pushed it through the hole and through the base. Once the wire was passed through the base, I simply put some glue between them and glued everything together. Now I knew that I was going to sculpt some flames around the crystal, so I decided to give the armature some further support with some more steel wire. I took some short lengths of steel wire and pushed it through the cracks and wound the edges of the steel wire around the armature. Once the armature was twisted into place, I decided to craft a stone fence around the base of the crystal. I did this using some XPF blocks, textured using the rock box method, which is basically putting the blocks in a box full of stones and shaking them silly till they are all textured. Once they were textured, I cut them into trapeze shapes and put them around the base of the model using some silicone glue. Now, because the shape of the crystal is non-uniform, I had to measure each and cut it into shape. This took a bit, but was more than worth my while. When the first row of crystals was done, I took some slimmer pieces of the XPF blocks and made a second row of blocks out of them. Now, because I had to cut two sides off of each block, I retextured those using my texture roller and glued them into place. While I was doing this, I decided to make it seem as if the flames, as they burst out of the crystal, cracked some of the stone fence, so I took some of my blocks and I glued them around where the lower crack on the crystal was, as if they were flung off of the fence. To do this, I also used some of the leftover slices I had cut off of the previous blocks, and came back with my texture roller just to make those blocks around the crack seem more roughed up. Once all the glue on the fence was cured, I came back with the filler and went over all the stonework, not including the floor tiles. I did this to give the stonework a much more realistic look. Where I come from, examples of ancient stonework can be found in most places you look, and most of those have some sort of cement or filling between the stone blocks. So I felt this was really necessary. I did this using a small tool, so simply taking some filler on the edge of the tool and then using my fingers to push in and smooth out any excess filler, like so. This also helped conceal the seam between the stonework and the base of the platform. While the filler was drying, I took a box cutter knife and I beveled the edges of the base. Now it's important while you do this not to bevel it to a sharp edge, because sharp edges break easily. I recommend beveling the edges till you get a 2mm thick edge. This will give you a nice, well-defined edge while keeping it durable. When all the edges of the base were beveled, I took some sandpaper, rolled it on a small piece of wood, and sanded down each of the edges to give it a nice rounded look. Now, as you work with MDF, it's important to wear gloves and a face mask. You do not want to breathe in the dust off this material. It is extremely dangerous. This is also a good point to note that I use green MDF, which is water resistant, which is very important when you work with water-based paints and washes. Unlike other types of MDF, this one warps less easily after contact with water and doesn't swell. Once the base is all shaped, it's time to glue the platform to the base. Simply smear a nice even layer of silicone glue on the bottom of the platform and press it firmly to the base. Then aerate till you get those nice glue strings that you see here. When you feel that you've aerated the glue enough before it dries, press it firmly back on the base and fasten them both together using some clamps, as you can see here. Leave it to dry overnight to get a full cure of the glue. When the glue has all cured, it's time to apply some sand and gravel to the base itself to give it a natural look. To do this, simply take some watered down PVA in a ratio of 1:1 using a paintbrush to smear it on the base and sprinkle a mix of sand and gravel over the glue. This will create a nice layer of dirt around the base, hiding the seam between the platform and the base. To really make this sand and gravel mix stick together and keep its volume, I simply spray some isopropanol on it and drip another layer of glue over the entire muddy surface. To really emphasize the ancientness of the platform itself, I take some glue smeared on selected parts of the platform, especially around where I cracked the stone fence around the crystal, and sprinkle some sand and gravel over there. Something to pay attention to while doing this last stone and gravel effect on the platform itself is not to overdo it. You don't want to hide all the nice detail and texture that you've worked hard into putting on the platform by just dumping a ton of gravel over it. Once the glue has fully cured, it's time to give the entire model a coat of black Mod Podge. This is simply some hard coat Mod Podge mixed in with some acrylic paint, and you should make note to water down the Mod Podge a bit to really make it seep into all of those cracks. When the Mod Podge has dried, it's time to start painting our model. Now, because I have envisioned the crystal as being greenish, I decided to go for a reddish-brown color scheme for the base and platform. This will really emphasize the crystal, and it's important to think about these things as you work, using some color theory to really make your builds more interesting. For the base itself, I went with burnt umber as the base coat, and later on I'll go and re-emphasize some of the gravel and stones using lighter shades to make them more visible. Once the base was painted, I went back using a mixture of burnt umber, sienna, and other brownish shades to go over the entire platform as a base coat, using a painting technique called overbrush, in which you heavily load your brush with paint, simply sweeping the brush from side to side on the model, not pressing hard. You're not trying to fill in all the cracks with paint, but just going side to side, brushing with the model with a heavy hand, putting down more and more color on the model. Now, I did this using a dirty brush, switching off my shades, giving the platform a nice brown reddish look. Something that I did make sure to do, though, was to progressively move to lighter and lighter shades of brown, and also using a lighter and lighter touch on the brush, making sure that I was depositing lighter and lighter shades over more raised part of the platform. To add some highlights to the platform, I mixed up my browns with some yellowish colors and used the lighter shade of brown to highlight the edges of the platform, the fence, and the steps to really make them pop. Now, this isn't really dry brushing because I'm using a large amount of paint on my brush, but it's as close to dry brushing as you get without really dry brushing. Once I was satisfied with the tone of the platform, I came back with some yellows, grays, and light browns, and re-emphasized some of the stones on the platform to break up the uniformity of it. When I had enough of these unique stones painted, I came back with a dry brushing of light reddish brown to connect all of those unique stones into the to the general color scheme of the platform. I do this using my Deerfoot brush. Deerfoot brush is a brush made for dry brushing. It's made with short, stiff hairs, perfect for depositing light amounts of paint on raised surfaces. Once the acrylic paint is fully cured, it's time to make some dark wash and apply it to the model. I simply mix some black acrylic with some burnt umber in a small cup of water, testing out the mix to see that it's thick enough but not too thick, and then applying it to the model. This wash will seep into all the cracks, re-emphasizing the depth of the texture and darkening the model. Once the wash is dried, I come back to the model with a dry brushing of light gray. It's time to start painting our crystal. As a base coat for the crystal, I use Green Stuff World's Abyssal Blue. This is a nice dark blue, which will give my crystal a nice deep look. Once I've covered the entire crystal in dark blue, I mix in some Vallejo Goblin Green into the blue, creating mid-shades between the green and the blue by mixing them together and applying it around the center of each crystal facet. This will create a nice transition between the blue and the green, and I apply these further shades using my Deerfoot brush to create nice smooth transitions between dark abyssal blue to light green, yellows, and finally whites. So as you can see, the crystal is slowly taking shape, creating a gradual lighting effect, making it seem as if more and more light is passing through the crystal, especially in the thinner areas, but in not reaching into those deep crystal depths. Something to note is that each consecutive lighter shade should be applied to a consecutively smaller area, closer and closer to where the facets meet. This will create a gradual lighting effect, and that's what you want to have in a glowing crystal. Now, if like me, you feel that the heart of a crystal isn't dark enough, you can reapply some of the darker color in the center of each facet, and then reapply lighter and lighter shades to just soften the edges between them. Once I was satisfied with the transparency of the crystal, I came back with shades of light greens and yellows and went over all of the edges of the crystal. I did this using the side of my paintbrush and not the tip. This gave me much more control of where I apply the paint, and I highly recommend it for when you try and highlight things. When the crystal was all painted and I was satisfied with how it looked, it was time to sculpt the flames. I used Freeform Sculpting Epoxy Clay. It's a dual component epoxy sculpting clay, very similar to Green Stuff, only gray, and it comes in much larger quantities. You simply mix even amounts of each of the components together, just like Green Stuff, and once you've kneaded it to an even shade of gray, you're ready to work. Also very similar to Green Stuff, Freeform is very tacky, but you keep your tools and gloves either wet or covered with a very fine sheen of Vaseline to keep them from sticking to the flames as you work. The first step is to cover the armature in Freeform. You do this by simply rolling out some nice thin long strips of Freeform and twisting it around the armature with my sculpting tool. When this is done, I start forming some spikes out of Freeform, which will give support to the flames that I will sculpt later on. I sculpt these spikes just like I'm going to sculpt the flames. I simply roll up some small balls of Freeform, tapering them on one edge by rolling them on that side. Then, using a leaf shape metal tool, I press down on the drops of freeform, pulling back as I press down. This will give each freeform spike a nice teardrop shape, and then I go back with my steel tool, creating flame-like indents on each drop. I take these drops and I stick them on the armature. They're very sticky. It's important though to work quickly so you don't lose that tackiness. I let these spikes dry because I want them to give a nice backing to the sculpt flames that I'm going to sculpt in a second. When they're dry, I come back with some more freeform and start shaping the flames for the entire build. Now freeform dries rather quickly, so I do this in batches. I need some freeform and form it into small balls, tapering them on one edge, and then using my steel tool to create that flame by pressing it down and back on each drop. But this time, instead of making solitary flames, I create batches of flames connected together. Once I have enough of these connected flames, it's time to add some tortured soul faces to them. To see how I actually make these, you can go to this link where I made a specific video on this, but in short, I take small pieces of freeform, roll them up into tiny snakes and put them on each flame. Then using a ball shaper, I create indents for the eyes, and below them 2 long indents to create the shape of the jaw. And using the skull shaper, I simply pull down to create a yawning maw. It's also important to use a variety of tools with different tip shapes and widths to prevent you from getting a uniform shape for your flames, because in reality flames aren't uniform. When these flame segments are ready, I take my tool and I apply them to the armature, sticking them in place. It's important to note that though freeform cures rather quickly, it still takes some time. So it's imperative that you stay next to your build and push your flames back up if they've bent down. Once the freeform has fully cured, and I recommend you give it at least a night to do this, it's time to paint the flames. Now, one of the advantages of freeform is that it doesn't need primer to paint well, and so the first thing I do is give it a nice dark coat of black. Then, using a bluish color scheme, moving from abyssal blue to light blue to white, I start giving the flames their colors, using the overbrush method with the darker blues, slowly transitioning to dry brushing as they reach light blues and whites.
Starting with shades of dark blue and slowly transitioning to lighter and lighter shades of blue and to a lighter and lighter touch with the brush. As you can see, I'm moving my brush from up to down to ensure that the lighter shades are deposited at the upper parts of the flames. This will accentuate the upper part of the flames. Really emphasize the tortured souls. I came back with some Bloody Red by Vallejo, and using a very small brush, added some red touches to each of the eyes on the model. Because red is a complementary color to green and blue, this really makes the eyes pop out and be much more noticeable. I connect the color schemes for the blue flames and the green crystal. Came back with some shades of green, ranging from goblin green to light green, and gave all the flames some light touches in blue and green. I did this both for the front of the flames, the bottom, and the back, making sure to put the darker shades at the bottom of the flames with the really light shades of light green on the top of the flames. I also mixed up a bit of yellow into my lighter shades of green to make them really glow and use that to emphasize each face. This will make them look much more noticeable on the backdrop of the blue flames. To finish up the flames, I came back with highlights of white and very, very light green and gave all of the flames a very light dusting like this. Now, because the flames shed a lot of light on the area surrounding the crystal, I decided to create an area of effect on the platform itself. I started by giving most of the platform in a circle around the crystal, a dark shade using my Geofoot brush and Abyssal Blue paint, and then using the same techniques I used to light up the crystal, I gradually create a lighting effect towards the crystal, transitioning between dark shades of blue to lighter shades of blue, and giving the lighted area a dusting in light green. Now, while I did this, I tried to make sure not to paint the bottom of the crystal, and not to paint the immediate area surrounding the wall. This creates the counter effect of shade, or area where the light doesn't reach. It really emphasizes the light itself. Now, I asked on Facebook what kind of plants or shrubbery would seem the most fitting for this kind of model, and one of the responses that I got is that it would be neat for there to be creepy roots growing out of the crystal itself and embedding themselves into the platform. And I thought this was really neat, so I went for it. I took some roots out of my root box and took them outside, spraying them with shades of dark blue and light green, and this is the final result. I took these and, using some fast drying glue, simply glued them to the base, making sure to make them crawl and sprawl all over the platform, but leaving room for gaming pieces. Once I was done with the roots, it was time to put down some static grass. I did this using static grass that I bought off of Green Stuff World, link below, and using my static grass applicator to make the grass stand up nicely. And I wanted the grass to complement the lighting effect that I created, so I transitioned gradually from burnt grass, closer to the lighting effect, to dry grass, to summer grass, the furthest away from the light source, simply dotting some PVA glue and putting down some static grass. Now, it's important to do this over a sheet of paper so that you can reuse any fibers that weren't stuck. And if you want to get a nice gradual transition between shades of grass, also very advisable to work quickly. This way, any spot of PVA that didn't get full cover of static grass fibers in one layer will get them in the next one. This way, you will get a slight mix between the shades. You don't want to get an even mix of both shades. Otherwise, you'll lose all definition. So this technique needs a bit of experimenting and trial and error to get down. Once the static grass is fully cured, I came back to the model with some clump foliage that I got off of Woodland Scenics, the link below. I made sure to use 2 shades of clump foliage and to use clumps of differing sizes and shapes. This is important to get a more natural look. You don't want to have even shrubbery. And that's how you make the dark crystal. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, found it interesting. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below in the comment section. If you really enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to become a supporter of the dungeon on Patreon, the link is down below. That's it. Till next time, I hope you guys have amazing adventures with your friends. And keep safe. And see you next time. Bye.